Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Well Said, where I interview policy experts, commentators, academics, students, and activists on topics of higher education, free speech, and other related topics of American culture and policy. You can share this episode on Facebook or YouTube, as well as any podcast platform such as Apple, Spotify, and Anchor. You can download the episode and listen anytime. If you like what you've heard today, give us our podcast a 5-star rating and go to our website, speechfirst.org, and press donate. I'm excited to welcome our guest today, Lathan Watts, who is the Vice President of Public Affairs at this great organization called Alliance for Defending Freedom. Thank you so much, Lathan, for joining us.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I'm excited about our topic too, because basically this is like part of the reason I came on with Speech First. You know, I see the legal realm, legal action as basically the last line of defense for most conservative issues, for anyone who still believes in the Constitution and in kind of what this country was founded on, the principles that you're founded on. The legal action kind of avenue is really where you're going to see kind of what I call is like we're holding the line, right, for free speech. Again, because we've lost a lot of the institutions on the conservative side, probably most of them. We've lost media, we've lost Hollywood, any kind of communications apparatus, in addition to education, K through 12 and higher education, as well as the medical institutions now are going further and further away from the founding principles of this country, trying to push some of their woke dogma through that. And we're seeing it also in the legal institutions, such as, law schools. So even though, they're going to come after the legal realm eventually, I think we still have quite a fighting chance here on the right with regards to making sure that the laws of this country are enforced and people are held accountable. So I would love for you to start off by telling us just a little bit about the Alliance for Defending Freedom, the history of the organization, and kind of what its purpose is and some of the stuff that you've been working on.
Certainly. Yeah. So ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom, was founded in 1994 by some Christian ministry leaders who saw a need for legal defense of these rights, as you mentioned. Our first president was Alan Sears, who led the organization for many years. And then Mike Ferris took over for him. Mike had been very active in the homeschool movement and community and helped establish Patrick Henry College. He led the organization also, a very strong way. And then just recently, actually last year, announced his retirement. So Kristen Wagner, who had been heading up our legal team, succeeded him as CEO. So she's now transitioning to more of the CEO role, but still very involved in our legal team and our litigation efforts. In fact, she argued our most recent Supreme Court case back in December, 303 Creative versus Elenis, expecting that decision maybe May or June. But it was founded, just as I said, because people saw a need for a legal defense of people's rights to live according to what they believe. We have represented, probably every denomination of Christianity you can think of, and maybe one or two you can't, but we've also represented people of other faiths because the principle applies to all of us. If we want to write for ourselves, we have to be willing to respect it for others. And so in the last 12, 13 years, we've won 14 Supreme Court cases. Hopefully,
that's awesome. That's great.
Yeah, been very, very blessed in that realm. Hopefully 303 will be number 15 here in another month or so. And we just filed a cert petition on behalf of College of the Ozarks. The Biden administration and the housing department has reinterpreted the word sex to include sexual orientation and gender identity, and is trying to force colleges, like even private religious institutions like College of the Ozarks, to allow men who identify as women to live in women's dorms, showers, locker rooms, the whole thing. So that case had made its way through the Eighth Circuit, and we just filed our cert petition last week, I believe. So hopefully Supreme Court will grant cert to that one, and I will be arguing that one soon. But ADF, we focus our litigation efforts defending religious liberty, free speech, the sanctity of life, marriage, and parental rights are the five big subject matter areas. Um, sometimes other issues can kind of fall into those buckets, like academic freedom, choice in education, whether it's defending teachers and students, professors in a university who, for religious reasons, would be happy to call a student by their preferred name, but just, cannot
Yeah.
go one step further and call them by a pronoun that they know not to be the case. Um, so, which, isn't of itself a free speech issue, but it kind of
Yeah.
touches on academic freedom as well. So, um, sometimes the lines can kind of get blurry between free speech and free exercise, and that's okay. They're both
Absolutely.
protected by the First Amendment, so we defend them all.
Yeah. How convenient, right? That the
Yeah,
founders put all of these specific outlaying of rights into one amendment. And it was kind of like this understanding at that point that this is about freedom of conscience. This is about freedom of expression. So we're going to take things like the press and speech and religious liberty. We're going to put it all in this amendment because it all kind of is connected to the same underlying principle, right?
yeah, exactly. I mean, Jefferson typically referred to religious liberty as the right of conscience.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what it means, even for people who aren't particularly religious. You should still care about religious liberty, because even if you're not a person of any sort of faith tradition, you likely have some set of ideas you want to live your life by. And for you, religious liberty protects that right. It's the right of
Mm-hmm.
conscience. It's the right to
Yeah.
live according to what you believe in all aspects of your life, whether that's in how you run your business, where you choose to go to church, how you raise your family, what's important to you and your kids' education, all aspects of life. I think one of the most dangerous trends recently is people trying to define religious liberty as you're free to believe whatever you want.
Yeah, that's a really
because
excellent point.
that confines religious liberty to, between your ears. You're free to believe whatever you want, but if you start acting on that belief out here, in the marketplace or in, quote, the real world, well, there's limitations to that. I mean, um, that's a very, very narrow and dangerous view of religious liberty. And you don't really have to be a constitutional scholar or a lawyer to understand that the word free exercise of religion, just look at the semantics. I mean, exercise implies
Right.
activity, right? If all it took for me to have six-pack abs is just to believe in my heart that I have them, then I would have them. Okay.
Yeah.
But I don't, because there's a certain amount of activity
Yeah.
involved to get them that I'm unwilling to do, right?
Right.
Exercise implies activity. So it's about living your faith every day in every aspect of
Right.
your life.
Well, let's
And
touch on that a little bit more just because we're talking about the overlap of specifically speech and religious liberty, but there's also a lot of other overlap, and you're talking about in your line of work, in business, and even in politics. And there is the politicians lately have been kind of debating this issue of the separation of church and state. And we've seen some folks come out and publicly say, even Democrats say that there is no real separation of church and state, because if you're a religious individual, it will inform most of your decision making, if not all of your decision making, and all of our, and we can get into some of the even more specifics about how where your religion is going, how our laws are based on certain various religious values. So I'd be curious what your thoughts are on all of that and everything we've been kind of hearing in the news and with politicians talking about whether or not there should be this separation of church and state.
yeah, so that phrase comes from a letter from Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptists, who were concerned about their state's weak protection of religious liberty. And he responded saying that he was, pleased that the First Amendment had this protection and had effectively erected a wall of separation between church and state. Um, but a lot of people have that's sort of been twisted into this idea that religious principles uh, or values have no place in the public sector. That, like I said before, it's just confined to the inside the four walls of your church. That wall of separation he's talking about was erected to protect the church.
Yeah.
Right? It
Right.
was to keep the government out of the church's business, not the other way around. And really, what it's about is protecting the proper role of religion in a free and civil society. They did not want there to be an official church in the United States of America like they had the Church of England. I mean, they just fought a war, with arguably the greatest empire in the history of the world at that time, that had the Church of England that you were taxed to support,
Mm-hmm.
whether you ever darkened the door of a Church of England or not. They didn't want that here. They wanted you to be able to be free to worship in however you saw fit. Um, but they understood the role of religion in a free and civil society is to create people who are capable of living in freedom, the virtues and the values necessary to live as free men amongst other free men. I think it was Adams in one of his letters
Yeah.
said the Constitution was written for a religious and moral people, and it's completely inadequate to the governing of any other. Because without that influence, um, often to restrain sort of the fallen nature of man,
Mm.
if everyone is just free to do what's right in the sight of his own eyes, then inevitably the strong will oppress the weak.
Yeah.
That's human history, right? And that's sort of the concept of natural law that
Mm.
Jefferson refers to in the Declaration, the laws of nature and nature's God. Um, that because you're created in the image of God, you're endowed with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that separation of church and state was intended to protect the role of religion in a free civil society. When people of faith exercise that faith, it typically makes life better for everyone. There are countless numbers of faith-based nonprofits and charities that are addressing, all sorts of societal ills that are founded upon a religious belief. They're rooted in the people that support that ministry, their religious belief, and they have the right to live out that faith in the public square, and by doing so, make life better for others. And that's really, that's really it. I mean, it's
Yeah.
honestly, it's not that complicated. It takes lawyers and judges to make something that simple more complicated, and over many decades we have. But the original intent was just, like I said, to protect the church, to keep the government out of their business. Churches are free
Right.
to hire their ministers and and people that work for them according to the beliefs that are important to them. So they have exemptions from certain employment laws based on that. Um, and that's the intent. It's
Mm-hmm.
protecting that role of religion in a free society to establish sort of a moral groundwork upon which everything else is built.
Okay, so that brings me to I want to talk a little about the cases that you mentioned. You mentioned 303 Creative versus Elena's. This is a really interesting case because it does address this intersection. So a lot of folks think it is actually a religious liberty case, but really it's more of a free speech case. But
Exactly.
at the same time, there's still this kind of religious liberty undertone to it, right? And so it kind of touches back on some of the Jack Phillips stuff in the state of Colorado. So let's talk a little bit about that and just kind of
Sure.
why. I mean, you can even talk about a little bit why there is kind of a religious undertone, but I would be just more interested in getting our viewers to understand what's going on in this case and why it's so
Right.
important for free speech.
Right. So you actually, to best understand it, you do have to sort of start with Jack Phillips,
Right.
who owns and operates Masterpiece Cake Shop there in Colorado, who was asked to bake a cake, a custom design a cake for a same-sex wedding. He adheres to a traditional biblical view of marriage and could not, in good conscience, make that cake. He'd be happy to, serve them on other occasions, just couldn't be a part of their wedding. That Then a complaint was filed against him, the Colorado Civil Rights Commission. That case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court basically said that the state of Colorado had been biased against his religious beliefs and gave him a victory in that case. But the ink was barely dry on the decision when somebody came back to his shop and asked him to make another cake that he
Right.
couldn't in good conscience make. Took him back in front of the Civil Rights Commission. He has basically been, in and out of court for almost a decade now, just
Oh
trying
my
to
gosh.
get the state of Colorado to recognize that he has a right to run his business according to what his beliefs are. And
Mm-hmm.
any artist has the right to decide what message they're going to create. So with that backdrop, our client in 303 Creative is Lori Smith, who does a web design business. And she had witnessed what had happened to Jack Phillips in Colorado, and she wanted to do custom websites for people's weddings. But she did not, because she knew if she did one, she has the sort of the same views on marriage that he does. She knew that if she did one for a heterosexual couple, but could not for a same-sex couple, she would end up in the same spot that
Right.
Jack Phillips is in, So she filed basically a lawsuit, a preemptive lawsuit, a pre-enforcement challenge to what's going on in Colorado. And pre-enforcement challenges are really a hallmark of civil rights litigation. They've been around for a long time. The basic premise is you shouldn't have to violate an unjust law and be fined and or go to jail before you have a chance to challenge the basis of the law. So with that said, she filed, as I said, sort of a pre-enforcement challenge. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. We argued it. Kristen Wagner, our CEO, argued in December. We expect the decision probably in May or June. But as you said, the difference is this is really more a pure free speech argument, and therefore the court's analysis will be likely more along the free speech precedents and the principles involved in a free speech case. Her reason for not wanting to speak this message may be rooted in her religious beliefs, but even if it wasn't, the point is government can't force you to speak a message, just like government can't censor you from speaking a message. Those are two halves of the same unconstitutional coin. The point is government telling a citizen, you must say this, right? And that goes for, a win for her would protect everyone. If you are, say, a video production studio and somebody from the March for Life comes in and wants to hire you to document their participation in the March for Life, but you happen to be a pro-abortion activist, you shouldn't be forced to create that product. And so a win for her would protect that person as well. And it gets back to if we want these freedoms for ourselves, we have to be willing to protect them, even for the people who may vehemently disagree with us. So that is sort of where we are in 303. I'm waiting on the decision, and hopefully it'll be a good one.
Great. Yeah. Hoping for another big win for free speech for sure. So you mentioned Kristen Wagner a little bit as well, who's currently running Alliance for Defending Freedom, and she's doing a great job, excellent leadership. I'm curious. So there was this big incident at Yale Law School not too long ago. You knew I was going to ask this, right?
Yeah.
This is going to come up at some point. Yeah. So she basically was invited to speak, actually debate someone, right? I'll have you give us the background of some of the details of the event, but was shouted down. The event had to be canceled, or I think eventually got rescheduled, but it had to be canceled because the student body at Yale Law School, who's supposedly supposed to be learning about, these things that we call natural law, the Constitution, and all these other issues, shouted her down so much that the event actually wasn't able to move forward. And they were so upset. And I think maybe it has something to do probably with ADF's involvement. I think maybe in the Jack Phillips case or what the actual reasoning was. I'm not sure why they were shouting her down. But if you could lay this whole thing out to us, because this was fascinating to me, again, that it was occurring in a law school, and it really makes you worry for our legal institutions.
Yeah, exactly. The irony of ironies is the purpose of the event. It was supposed to be a demonstration of civil discourse.
Right.
She was invited by, I believe it was the FedSoc chapter at Yale Law. And they invited Kristen, and I'm blanking on who the other person was, but somebody who clearly on the other side of issues that we litigate, to engage in a civil discussion and debate on the issues and demonstrate civil discourse.
Right.
And the student body at Yale Law School was, so upset by this. As you said, they yelled, they screamed, there were people pounding on the walls, that everybody participating in the panel had to end up being escorted out by campus police. Now, to Yale's credit, they did reschedule it. They had it again just recently. And Kristen was there. Nadine Strassen, who's former head of the ACLU, was there. And they had, better security, better ground rules, and the debate was fine, right? And that's what we lose when in this sort of cancel culture idea.
Right.
We lose the ability to discuss with people with whom we disagree important issues. There's a quote, I think it's Marcus Aurelius, so that if somebody proves to me that I'm wrong, I'm paraphrasing, I have no problem with that, because I'm seeking truth.
Right.
And the truth doesn't harm anyone. It is the person who proceeds in their own self-deception that is harmed. And you lose that opportunity when you can't even have a conversation. I
Right.
think it's something that we are losing in this country. And as you said, it was disturbing to see, future attorneys at
Yeah.
Yale Law School behave in such a way. Um,
Well, I'd also like to point out, I know you said to Yale's credit, they eventually hosted the event again. But it was also after a huge media campaign that basically embarrassed them and showed that Yale Law School is not friendly to free speech on campus. And as well as an Article 3 judge, Judge Ho, writing a letter to a bunch of other Article 3 judges saying, we are not going to take clerks from Yale Law School as long as they behave this way. Because again, like he was recognizing that this was a serious concern for future attorneys. These are future litigators, future even politicians,
sure.
future judges should understand the basic concepts of free speech and open discourse in this country.
Exactly. Yeah. And Judge Ho did publicly say he wasn't going to hire any clerks from Yale Law, and some other
Right.
judges sort of signed on to that idea as well. And I think Yale Law did the right thing, and hosted the event and went off basically without a hitch.
Right. Yeah. That's great. Yeah, it's great to hear. So like, what are your thoughts on the future of litigation in this country and, kind of judicial activism? Because I have a big concern with I worry that judicial neutrality is going to be something that is not only valued less, but eventually will disappear over time as we become a much more politicized country. And as folks, especially in law schools, are not necessarily teaching the foundational principles of our legal system. They're not teaching that the Constitution is one of those foundational documents. They're teaching more that the Constitution is racist and should be changed. So when you start to see how the education system is treating these concepts, what do you think is kind of, what holds in the future? And what are your thoughts on how we can make sure that our legal system is not compromised?
That's a big, big
I
question.
know. Yeah, it's a big one for you. Yeah.
The role of the judge is really to decide what the law is, not what it should be. That's the
Right.
legislature's job. And I think too many people view the judiciary, particularly the Supreme Court, because that's for the average American, the court that they pay attention to, as some sort of super legislature, that these nine people, can decide that this is what the law should be in this country, and that's not, what they're supposed to do. The founders very wisely gave the federal judiciary sort of immunity from popular election, because sometimes the will of the people, expressed through the legislature or other ways, can conflict with the Constitution. And if that's the case, it is the judiciary's role to say no.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they also built in, if the people want it bad enough, they can amend the Constitution. If the judges say the Constitution doesn't allow this, people want it bad enough, there's an amendment process. But this this sort of idea that they're somehow lawmakers really is unfortunately pervasive, I think, in our culture. And so, what we can do, I think it's up to really every parent to, you absolutely must take control of your child's education.
Yeah.
Regardless of whether or not they're in the government school or charter school or private school or homeschooled. You have to take responsibility for what your children are learning. And if they're not being taught what you feel they should be taught, when they're in school, then it's up to you to teach them. Some states have, broader options when it comes to school choice, and you might be able to find a different school. Great. I was, fortunate enough, there was a great classical charter school that my kids have gone to. If that's not an option, some people choose to homeschool, and that, I think we've seen really a lot of growth in homeschooling in the last, decade.
Speaking of homeschooling, you mentioned, I think you're the previous president of ADF, you said was president of Patrick Henry College.
Mike Ferris.
Right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I think I just recently read something about Patrick Henry College having the highest LSAT scores right now, one of the highest sets of LSAT scores coming out. And I think everyone I know who's gone to Patrick Henry College actually is homeschooled. There's just like a large influx of homeschooled kids to Patrick Henry College. So I think there's definitely a connection there that can be teased out.
Yeah, and having multiple options as the right education for your child is certainly beneficial for everybody.
Hmm.
But even if maybe those options aren't available to you, like because of work obligations or whatever, like you can't homeschool, like
Right.
if you are,
Yeah.
basically stuck with the ISD, it's still up to you to demand the type of education for your child that is beneficial for your child, and or supplement it yourself at home. You can have, you good conversations at home over topics, whether or not they're taught in the schools or not. And, if you go back to sort of what the founders envisioned for education, it was to instill the virtues necessary so that the next generation of citizens,
Right.
again, would be capable of living in a free society. That's really the whole purpose of education. It's not necessarily to, I mean, prepare you for college is a good thing, but they're supposed to be preparing citizens to live in a republic.
Exactly.
Maybe a quaint notion these days, but it's one that we still should adhere to.
Right. Absolutely. And, when we're thinking about, concepts like separation between church and states, the reason why those types of concepts are so widely misused in this country or misapplied is because there's a lack of education in the real history behind them, just like kind of what we discussed earlier. And there's not a lot of folks who are essentially, like you mentioned earlier, also seeking truth and through conversation and open discourse and civil discourse and through debates. So that's something that we see a lot on the college campuses in our line of work, and I'm sure you've seen a lot in your line of work. But it is interesting. I think that's something that ADF does really well, is like kind of address, again, a lot of these issues that also what we kind of see as like this intersection of, free speech and religious liberty and some of the other major constitutional questions that are always constantly interacting with one another. So speaking of kind of some of like the legal questions that we're talking about, obviously the DOJ plays a significant role in determining what kind of cases are pursued by the government, especially against American citizens. And we've been hearing a lot lately. And this one is something that I just was listening to today on the news, was where, there's a Senate committee hearing with the DOJ involved of viewpoint discrimination essentially against various protesters, where there are cases being pursued against protesters who are conservative. Maybe they're protesters who are protesting abortion clinics. And I think the one that I'm specifically thinking of is Mark Hook, or I can't say it. Sorry, his last name's right. Yeah. And then there's also, then there's protesters who are actively, outside of justices' homes, violating laws by trying to coerce Supreme Court justices to not rule, or to rule a certain way, essentially in that Dobbs case where there was a major leak. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on kind of DOJ's viewpoint discrimination on this, if you think it's definitely valid, what your concerns are for how we start to view how the law should be used in order to restrict rights versus to restrict government action.
Right. I think the most important thing that comes out of that, when you see, one person treated one way and another person treated another way, is it sort of festers this distrust in the government from the people that it's supposed to serve. And that's dangerous for the life of any republic. And so whatever has to be done at the DOJ to sort of right the ship, if there's, I can't speak to whether there's some institutional bias one way or another, right. But when you see that, just as you said, nothing being done about people protesting in front of a Supreme Court justice's house versus people showing up with semi-automatic rifles on a guy's house because he was protesting abortion, it does create this idea that there's this sort of two-tiered justice system based on whatever your viewpoint is. And that is as fundamental a violation of the rule of law as there can be. I mean, there's a reason the symbol of justice is the lady holding the scales who's blindfolded, right? I mean, everybody should be equal under the eyes of the law. And, so whether or not it's some, big conspiracy or whatever, that sowing a seed of distrust between the citizens and those in charge of protecting their rights, excuse me, is a dangerous dangerous current that's going on right now. People need to be able to have confidence in people who are in those offices, because again, going back to sort of the whole point of the purpose of government, you go all the way back to Jefferson in the Declaration, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Right. That's the point of government. It's to protect the rights of the people. And when people think they're not going to get a fair shake from the people who are supposed to be protecting their rights, depending on what they believe, that does not bode well for the future of a democratic republic.
Right, absolutely. And I always make this point to students. I always mention to them, hey, we're probably the only country in the world that actually, when you read our Constitution, when you read our Statement of Rights, we are putting restrictions on what the government can do. We are not putting restrictions on the rights of the individual. And most of the time, when you read any other Constitution or Statement of Rights from other countries, they're putting restrictions on what rights individuals have. And so it's a very different perspective, a very unique way of looking at the government's role in society, which is, I think sometimes we forget that even in like Western society, we constantly want to compare ourselves to Western Europe and Canada, but they have a very different view and understanding and culture of government rule than compared to us. So that is something that, again, it's like you have to hammer this home that we are a unique and different country. Stop trying to adopt laws of other countries.
Exactly, because we are, even within what's considered sort of the West, Western Europe, and here we are unique in that aspect. If we lose these things here, there's nowhere left to go.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's why we have to do the work that we have to do to preserve this, because it is a sort of a unique, throughout human history, a unique experiment in self-government. And it's essential, like I said, that these things are defended here, and those who are charged with protecting those rights are held to that standard, because this is it. And if you look at what's going on, in Western Europe, ADF also does some international work.
Oh, right. I forgot about that. If you want to talk a little bit about any of the issues you guys have been focusing on.
Sure. I mean, the one that's probably getting the most attention right now is in the UK, where a lady has now been arrested twice for simply standing basically outside an abortion clinic, silently praying. She wasn't even saying anything. And then the police officer asked her, if she was praying, and she said, well, maybe in my mind. He said, well, you're praying, and that's the problem. So, they cuff her and take her to jail. I mean, this is,
that's one of our closest allies, right? Like,
right. I mean, this is, for lack of a better term, our mother country, right? This is where a lot of the concepts that were implemented here started. Mm-hmm. I mean, like Jefferson in the Declaration, basically what they were saying was, if you would just treat us as Englishmen, we wouldn't have a problem. But you're not treating us the way you treat, and so that's how far it's gone there. We're actively involved in that case, and others in Western Europe. But that's why it's so important that our country continues to be this sort of outpost of these ideas, to be an example for the rest of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. One more issue I want to talk about before we take on is the Title IX issue. So we're seeing the Biden administration has proposed new rules and regulations through the Title IX sexual harassment policy in this country. It's a federal policy that all public educational institutions will have to abide by. And they have decided to kind of redefine harassment and various aspects of, the process of what one should go through, the rules around that, but also with regards to protected classes. And so there is going to be a serious intersection here of free speech and religious liberty when it comes to defending one's rights, because they are adding gender identity as a protected class, which does, obviously butt heads with a lot of when we understand like religious liberty, forcing people to use pronouns, forcing people to use gender affirmation language is not only a violation of their First Amendment speech rights, but also their religious liberty rights. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on this whole thing coming down the pipe, because there's obviously, I talk about the speech angle a lot. There's obviously a lot of other stuff attached to it with regards to bathrooms and athletics programs. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on all that.
Yeah, I mean, we've been very active under Title IX protecting women's sports
Mm-hmm.
for this very reason. Um, and fortunately for private institutions and religious, faith-based schools, there is a religious exemption to some of the things under Title IX, but we're even seeing that challenged,
Right.
and
Yeah.
we're having to constantly defend that in court as well. Um, but this all stems from, just as you said, people reinterpreting the word sex to include sexual orientation and gender identity. Um, and again, if you go to the original text of the statute and what the text meant at the time it was passed, it did not mean that.
Right.
And I think evidence of that is that Congress has attempted to amend it before. And in Title VII, I can't remember if they've tried to do Title IX or not, but they had tried to do it in Title VII and couldn't get the amendment passed.
Mm-hmm.
Well, why were they trying to amend it to mean that if it already meant that, right? Because
Right.
clearly it didn't.
Right.
Right.
That's
So
a good
this
point.
is,
Yeah.
and this is, why these things end up in court. As I said, the judiciary, when there's questions over the meaning of a statute or the proper application of a statute or the interpretation of it, their role is to say what the law is, not what it should be. If you want to change the law, there's a legislative process to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And but we've seen presidents, honestly, from both parties, um, go through sort of the executive route to say, we administer this, we enforce it, and we interpret this word to mean this. Um, that that doesn't really fly with the constitutional order of
Right.
separation of powers. Um, Even in things like, if you're going to make a rule change under an executive branch agency, there's the Administrative Procedures Act, that there's certain steps you have to go through to do that, including taking in public comment. Um, and our case with College of the Ozarks, that's basically what it's about.
Right. Yeah.
They reinterpreted this under the Housing Act. They did not take public comment. Um, and again, it was sort of a pre-enforcement challenge to that. So it's going to play out, and it's going to be in court, I think, for a while, probably, in maybe in various courts.
Yeah.
One way that things typically make their way to the Supreme Court is if you have a split in the circuit courts. So you may see this challenged in multiple circuit courts where,
Right.
say, the Ninth Circuit rules one way and the Fifth Circuit rules another way. It's not a guarantee the Supreme Court will take it, but they
Yeah.
really can't allow the law to mean one thing in California and something different in Texas.
Right.
So that's typically a way that sometimes these cases do find their way to the Supreme Court, is when you have a circuit split. So,
Yeah.
and we may see that. It's hard to
Yeah.
predict. I got out of the predictions business a long time ago. um,
Yeah.
we just sort of take it as it comes.
Yeah. And I think, and there's definitely going to be a lot of legal challenges just because there are so many questionable things about the new rules. And in my opinion, like very blatantly, obviously unconstitutional things that they're trying to do with the new rules. So yeah, that'll be very interesting to see it play out once the rules are most likely finalized this year, late spring, early summer. But we'll see. I've been letting students know, like, hey, just a heads up, once this goes into action, coming fall semester, they're going to brief you on this at your orientation programs, and they're going to expect you to follow it. And faculty members also, not using, if you accidentally use someone's dead name, they interpret that was on purpose and they want to report you to the Title IX Sexual Harassment Office, they will have the ability to do that. And the universities will have the federal mandate to process you and to prosecute you under Title IX. So that is something that's really scary for a lot of students and a lot of professors, and they should just be kind of being aware of that. But there are organizations like ADF and Speech First that exist to take these cases on and make sure
Exactly
that
right.
it is addressed, right? Well, thank you so much, Lathan, for coming on to Well Said. I think this was an excellent conversation, just kind of laying out some of the various issues of, that you're working on at ADF, but also just discussing, again, this kind of intersection of like all these various freedoms and liberties that we have in this country and how they all play together towards a common goal. And that's kind of what the founders intended. So I think it was a great discussion to kind of tease out some of that stuff. I'd love to have you back on after we get the 303 creative case decision so that we
Sure.
can actually go do a deep dive in that one. I think it'd be really great. And I know that Jack Phillips, I think, is under attack again. Is this right?
Yeah.
In Colorado? Oh my goodness.
Hopefully, if we get a good decision in 303, hopefully that
Right.
will sort of moot the case that's against him, or at least force Colorado to abide by the
Yeah.
303 precedent. Um, but yeah, I've enjoyed it. Yours is a great organization. There's plenty of work for all of us.
Oh
So
yeah.
when people listen to this, if they're concerned about some of these things, Speech First is great. ADF, if you want to contact us, it's adflegal.org. And I should have said when I was talking about us, we operate as a nonprofit. We never charge our clients. So if you need our help, that's where you find us.
Right.
And
And you're on social media too, Twitter, and like people can follow your cases and updates at
Yep.
various things.
Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, probably several others.
Yeah. Right. There's too many to keep track of.
I'm getting too old to keep up with all of that.
Right, exactly. Well, thanks so much for joining us, everyone, today. I hope you learned a lot. I'm Cherise Trump, and Lathan, that was well said.